Thank you very much, Luke. Hi, my name is Matt Breen. I am with the Explorers podcast. I am the Explorers podcast. And today we are going to do Improvise Adapt Overcome Explorers Back from the Brink. And what today's story is, we're going to cover three different explorers, famous explorers and some not so famous. And what we'll do is, this will be at a very, very high level. And what we'll do is we will talk about what they accomplished. Oh, and these are explorers who got in really, really bad situations and were able to survive and come back and accomplish amazing things. We will talk about them at a very high level. We will talk about their accomplishments, but we'll also talk about what allowed them to do what they did. As we said, this will be about 20 minutes, then we'll do a Q&A. So please shoot your questions into the little chat thing along the way, and I'm happy to answer them at the end here. So first person we're going to cover is Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. Cabeza de Vaca was a Spaniard, and he was part of the 1527 Narvaez expedition. Now, this was to Florida, and people are saying, well, what are you going to Florida for? And at the time, they were going there for plunder, not that they realized there wasn't anything there. What had happened was Cortez had conquered the Aztec Empire in a few years earlier, and everyone wanted to repeat that. They all wanted to go find this rich kingdom overflowing with gold and so forth and come back rich. Well, so you'll see this repeat all the time throughout early colonial times of Spain here, where they go and looking for the next big kingdom. So there is a 300-man expedition, the Narvaez expedition, which would arrive in what is approximately modern day Tampa. And you can see, I've put a map up here, and I want to point out a lot of these slides are just to help you out. They're not critical, but they would arrive in what is approximately Tampa Bay, the Tampa Bay area of Florida. And they would go about looking for their big, exciting kingdom to go plunder. Well, as we know, there is no big kingdoms like that in Florida. So these guys would essentially wander to the north, at the same time gradually suffering from disease and illness, fighting, malnutrition, until they got to the point up in the north where they were essentially ready to go back. Only at this point, they had lost contact with their ships and couldn't go back. So they went about building some boats, and they didn't have the capabilities to build boats that could go on the ocean that would get them back to Cuba. So what they decided to do was build these 5 rafts, kind of boats, kind of rafts, and sail along the Gulf Coast to the west. The idea being that they would go down the coast of what is now Texas and then Mexico and reach Spanish civilization that way. Well, this didn't go too bad until they reached what is the Mississippi River. And the Mississippi is a powerful, huge river, obviously. And the currents there pushed these boats out to sea. And they eventually got caught in a storm. And 3 of the 5 boats would be swept out to sea and never seen again. 2 of these other boats would then land in what is now Galveston, Texas. They would be destroyed. And there was 80 survivors. Now, this is November, so winter's on the horizon, and these guys are already suffering terribly from malnutrition. And when spring would come around, there would only be 15 of them left. All the rest had died, mostly, again, from starvation. And some of the survivors, by the way, had turned to cannibalism as a way to make it through the winter. Well, so here we have 15 guys stranded in the middle of nowhere. No one knows where they are. They would all basically be captured and enslaved by the local Indian tribes. And this is a situation that would basically last for 2-3 years. And these men gradually dying off or disappearing over this time. And that would lead us to only 4 survivors. One of them, a man that I mentioned, Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. And these guys would escape together at one point. And what they did was they initially tried to go to the south trying to reach Spanish settlements, but they would be stopped by hostile natives and the geography. And then they would turn back north and skirt around the mountains and make this huge, and if you can see the map there, you can see they make this huge loop going all over the southwest of North America. They would cross through Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, northern Mexico, and then down the west coast of Mexico until they finally reached Mexican to Spanish settlement there. When they finally got to what they would call civilization, it was 1535, which means they had been, since they had left Cuba in 1527, 8 years out in the wilds. And this is just an astounding thing. And about half of this they had spent on this wandering since they had escaped. Now, that journey of itself is just amazing. They had able to not only cross oceans, but they had crossed deserts and mountains and countless other things, challenges, especially starvation. That was the biggest thing. Now, we talk about this and we say, well, how did they manage to do this? Because I said at the front, I said, what made these people able to do this? And the thing with Cabeza de Vaca was him and his 3 companions, what they did was they traveled across all these lands, and Cabeza de Vaca played himself as a faith healer. And this was not just an act, but what he did was he would come to towns, and he was a very religious man, and he would use Christian iconography and rituals, and he would pray with people, and he would try and help them with their problems. Now, sometimes he actually did have medical knowledge that would help people. So he became respected. And his word of him would reach villages, and his arrival would be this big deal. He was like this shaman guy. And he would turn this into shelter and food and travel to the next town. And he did this over the course of basically 4 years, crossing, like I said, mountains and deserts until he reached Spanish settlements. I find this just an incredible thing because he used his smarts. He took what he was given. He had virtually nothing, and he was able to overcome, so many obstacles and come out alive. And the other thing that I think that was really fascinating about what he accomplished was he didn't just get back and everything. He wrote down his story, and he didn't just write, this is what I did, this is where I went. He actually recorded stuff about the native tribes that he encountered along the way. He had great sympathy for them. He had lived with them and liked them for years. And some of the stuff that he wrote down is the only recorded information we have of some of these cultures, some of which basically would disappear in the coming years due to disease and conflict and so forth. So that is the story of Alvar Nunez Cabeza de Vaca. And like I said, we're going to do 3 of these kind of just very high level. The next person I want to touch on is Francisco de Orellana. Excuse me. Orellana is, again, get a drink, is again a Spanish conquistador. And he was a relative of Francisco Pizarro, the conqueror of the Inca. And he, in fact, had lost an eye while fighting for his brother or his cousin. And so we give him an eye patch there. And he would take part in another expedition to go find loot. Again, here, this was led by Francisco Pizarro's brother, Gonzalo. The idea was to march over the Andes Mountains and go find City of Gold, El Dorado, whatever you want to call it. Or there was another place, the Valley of Cinnamon, spices, all very valuable. This would be 220 Spanish soldiers, 200 or thousands of war dogs, 200 horses, and 4,000 native porters and guides. Well, crossing the Andes is not a simple thing. You have to get up to 14,000 feet, and no one, especially the native people, was built for this or clad, wearing proper clothing and so forth. When they got to the other side, essentially 3 of the 4,000 natives were gone. They had either died of starvation or cold or smallpox, which was running through the ranks, or they deserted. Well, at this point, the Spanish are now suffering from malnutrition. And so Pizarro says to his lieutenant, Orellana, let's build a boat, a brigantine, and we'll sail you down this river that we came to. And you're going to go find food and scout out the way. Well, Orellana would do this, and he'd take about 55 men or so. They'd sail down the river, and they would get to a point where they realized they couldn't go back. The river, they couldn't sail the boat upstream against the river the way up and get back. So they said, you know what we need to do? We need to go downriver. And what Orellana probably didn't recognize at the time was that he was on a river that was a tributary to the Amazon. And what he was proposing to do, and what you're seeing on the map now, was sail from the headwaters of the Amazon all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. And this is, and he will do this. This will be the most epic river adventure of exploration in history. It is 4,000 miles. This is a twisting and snaking river. The Amazon, in length, like if you look at it, miles, just looking at a map, is about 2,000, but you double that when you put in all the twists and turns that the river has. And it's incredible what they did. He was inventive and he was focused. And that is why he was able to do this. He and his men built a second brigantine so that they could all go down the river. And they would then sail, like I say, for months on end. Communication was another huge thing that Orellana believed in. He was quite the linguist himself. And what was cool was he would arrive at a new territory of a tribe, and he would try to communicate with them. He would try to make friends. He would try to get an interpreter, and that would allow him to trade. That would allow him safe passage through certain areas, and then hopefully an introduction to the next tribe or groups of tribes of people that he would be down the river. And what was amazing was this worked a lot. Not always. He did have to fight, but he sailed down the river using, like I say, his smarts. He used communication. He was willing to trade. Also, again, he stayed focused. Going down the river, there were a lot of times where they would hear stories of gold or whatever, of great cities, and he never let him or his men get off track. And thus, he would lead all of his men to the Atlantic Ocean. And from here, they're not done. They would then have to sail up the South American coast to the Caribbean, which is where the closest Spanish settlement was. This was another 1,300 miles. So in the end, they would go through jungles and oceans, battles. They would fight diseases, malnutrition. And he would get 43 of those roughly 55 guys back to a Spanish settlement in the Caribbean. It was pretty amazing. He had taken what he had been given, and that's what I think was so amazing about Orellana. And he had stayed focused, and he had gotten him and his men back. Interestingly, Orellana would go back to Spain. He would then lead another expedition back to the Amazon, the idea of building a settlement and so forth. Well, that would fail miserably, and he would end up dying in that expedition. But the last thing about Orellana I want to mention is that his journey is not well known by a lot of people for whatever reason. But I say we remember him probably most because he ends up, there's just him on the Amazon. He ends up making an appearance in Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, a bad Indiana Jones movie. And that is him there. They find his body as a plot device in a very bad film. But anyhow, that is the story of Francisco de Orellana. Now, our next person is going to be one of the most famous explorers in the world, and that will be Ernest Shackleton. There was an earlier session on Shackleton, so some of you might have seen that, and I hope you enjoyed it because it was really good. But Shackleton was, at this time of 1914, was already a famous polar explorer, and he led the Imperial Trans-Antarctic Expedition. And the idea was essentially to cross Antarctica. For that, he took the ship Endurance and lead it to the south to the Weddell Sea. They did have a lot of red flags, too much ice in front of them, but he would still push into it. And in February of 1915, the ship would get stuck in the ice and never get unstuck. There's the ship being crushed. It would, the men would get off the ship, and they would spend basically 6 more months just waiting while the ice shifted, while they took the flow. And in November of 1915, the ship would eventually be crushed and lost. From this point, here's a little map, and you can see, if you follow the orange line there, that shows you where the Endurance floated, basically on the ice floe. But at that point, then, the men camped out on the ice. They did try to drag the boats for a while to, it was too open water, but that only got a few miles. But at this point, things were just brutal, because this is where things really could have gone wrong, because men are just waiting. They had 3 lifeboats, and we're just waiting for the water to break. And we're talking, this is going to be months. And this is where Shackleton is really, really so good, and where things could have fallen apart, but he rose to the occasion in such an amazing way. He was gold in a crisis. And I have a quote from one of the scientists on one of the organizations, and he said, "For a joint scientific and geographical piece of organization, give me Scott, Robert Falcon Scott. For a winter journey, Wilson. For a dash to the pole and nothing else, Munson. And if I'm in the devil of a hole and want to get out of it, give me Shackleton every time." And that shows you what people thought about Shackleton at that moment. Now, this is really ironic, because in real life, Shackleton was nothing like this. He was, in a lot of ways, he failed at most everything he did. He was unfocused. He was he didn't have the patience. He didn't have the desire to stick with things. He was always jumping from project to project to make some money or whatever. But here on the ice, when things were at their worst, he was gold. He kept his men busy. They had poetry readings and music. One of the men had a banjo, and so they would have music for the men all the time. They would play games. And he kept them, he set routines. He just kept them busy. He worked with them. He was never afraid to do anything that the men would have to do as well. If they had to scrub stuff, he would scrub stuff. If they had to haul gear, he would haul gear. And they loved him for it. They called him the boss. And I always say, there's more than one time he'll say something to a guy and say, "So what are you going to do when we get out of this?" And they'd be like, "Well, I'm going on your next expedition." And that's how much they loved him. And not everyone, but they just adored him. And he led by example, which again, I think is really amazing. And I'll give you an example of that. When they were moving and they had to get rid of gear, he said nothing unnecessary. So he took his own gold watch and threw it out. He took a Bible given to him by the Queen, tossed it out. Again, he was willing to do that and lead by example. And again, his men loved him, and he inspired them. He made them feel like there was hope. And that's what was really cool. So they would eventually, the men would eventually reach, the water would break. They would get in their boats. And here's one of them. There were 3 of them. And they would reach a small place called Elephant Island. And from there, Shackleton, along with 5 other men, would take the boat and sail toward South Georgia Island. And this of itself is probably the most amazing part of this whole thing, if it isn't already extraordinary, because they have to go across 800 miles of terrible, terrible weather. And there's times they'd wake up and there'd be a foot of ice just caked on the boat, and they'd have to chip it off. And one of my favorite moments Shackleton talks about was he was looking down the horizon, going like, "Oh, it looks like the weather's breaking. I can see the clear skies." Those clear skies were not clear skies. They were a wall of water. There was a tidal wave coming towards them. It is believed a calving glacier had caused it. Luckily, the little boat would survive, and they would keep going towards South Georgia Island, which I want to say was an incredible thing, because this is a small island, and if you miss it, left or right of it or whatever, you just keep going. The current's going to take you, and there's no way they survive. But they nailed it. They did get to South Georgia Island, and they're not done yet, because what happens here is you have to cross South Georgia Island because he's on the wrong side of it. And this is not simple. By the way, there's a map showing where South Georgia Island is in relation to the Weddell Sea and Elephant Island. But this is a picture of South Georgia Island. This is a place with 10,000 foot high mountains. Now, they only had to do 3,000 feet only, but considering they were exhausted and freezing, but they did it in 36 hours. They took nothing with them, short of a little bit of food. They had no blankets. They had no sleeping bags. They had no tents. They said, we're just going to march. It was Shackleton. Again, he never did something anyone wouldn't do. And 2 other men. And they would make it. And they almost died several times, but they made it. Within a few days, they would rescue the men on the other side of the island and then head off towards Elephant Island to go rescue the rest of the crew. Now, that would take 4 tries because some of the ice wasn't broken up with them, but they would eventually get them all, and every one of them would get back. The thing I found crazy about this is that Shackleton, in all of this, like they spent, 2 years out on the in the ocean and on the ice. Shackleton had a bad heart issue. He never let anyone know about it. He knew he had it, and he could have basically died at any time. And he did die of a heart attack in 1922, and that's how he was a massive heart attack. The thing about Shackleton that's amazing is I use the word willpower, and it's so nutty because people don't. Sometimes I kind of like whatever, but I don't think anyone exemplifies just the sheer amazing will that the man had to get his men home, and that is exemplified in this whole thing with the endurance and this expedition. I think, like I say, I think sometimes willpower and so forth is overstated, but what Shackleton showed was incredible, and he kept his men focused. He kept them occupied. He gave them hope. Shackleton was not a great explorer in reality. He made all sorts of mistakes in planning, and not all of his decisions were good ones. But I don't think there's anyone who was more inspirational as an explorer than Ernest Shackleton. What he did was simply just astounding. So I'll just wrap up by saying, we did Improvise, Adapt, Overcome Explorers back from the brink. And I think we really see that from these guys. None of these guys were narrow-minded. They were willing to listen. They were willing to work. They were willing to adapt to their circumstances and their surroundings. And that is reassuring. And it is why they were successful. They listened to others. And when they were presented with terrible situations, they stayed focused. They stayed focused, and they didn't allow themselves to get drawn away from other things. They communicated with the people that they encountered, and it was just, they ended up doing extraordinary things in that. If you're interested in any of these guys, I have done a series on Cabeza de Vaca and one on Oriana, and that's like few hours, for a couple hours, 2 or 3 hours for each of those guys. And we will be covering Shackleton starting next month. I will on the podcast. And that is Explorers Podcast, explorerspodcast.com. And that is what I have for my presentation. It was about explorers on the brink and guys who should really never have gotten back to the world. And I hope you enjoyed it. So now I've got a couple questions here. I'll throw them out at you. Well, just one now. So if you do have any, I'm happy to answer anything. First one I got is from Daniel Branchfield. And Daniel writes, I get the impression that your podcast that common sailors and pirates died from diseases at a much faster rate and sooner on their trips than the more famous explorers themselves leading the expeditions to America. Is that actually true? If so, what is these leaders had that helped them live longer than sailors and pirates? This is just a general history thing right now. And so, yeah, a lot of times what you have is exactly true. And you'll say, why did one group of people survive better than others? One of the biggest things, especially on long voyages, will be scurvy. And scurvy is the lack of vitamin C. And what happens is generally you will find that the more money you have, the better provisioned the ship will be. And I'm going to use Ferdinand Magellan as an example. Him and his men had a quince jelly. A quince is a small fruit, and they used it. It was a jelly. What they didn't realize was it had vitamin C in it, because no one knew what vitamin C was at the time. And thus, that is how they actually, his officers, at least in him, got vitamin C, and how they survived while a lot of his men were dying from scurvy. Pirates and common sailors just don't get that good of food. And it's not just that, but other foods and things like that. They're going to be better prepared, better fed. Fresh meat is really important too. And meat is another thing that you're going to have more common access to as an officer and so forth. So you can get a little bit of vitamin C from fresh meat. And so that is how you can actually survive. And they do use it. They do get it. In like the Antarctic and Arctic, they do survive by eating just mostly meat and just getting enough of that vitamin C that'll keep them survived. And ultimately, there's just, with pirates and more common soldiers, you're going to get treated less well. You're going to get less food. You're going to get less fresh stuff. You're just going to get more crappy stuff. Pirates, especially, it's so erratic, their diets, that you just don't get that. So thank you, Daniel. Luke asked a question, and would Orellana's expedition east across Latin America come up with the Treaty Latin America, contrive the Treaty of Tordesillas with Portugal? And yes, this was in 1490. Oh, trying to remember the exact year of the 94, the Treaty of Tordesillas, which basically delineated where Portugal and Spain controlled, and where the mouth of the Amazon was technically in the area that would have been Portugal's, and there was some issues there, but the exact definition of the treaty is a little bit hazy, and it was later amended. So when Orellana did this, now again, this is just the mouth area. When he gets into the interior of South America, it wasn't as big of an issue. But when Orellana did this and he went back, there was a bit of the Portuguese going, "Hey, that's our territory," and but they did it anyways, because they kind of said, "We're here. Oh, we think that it's fine." And there was some controversy, a bit of a controversy, and that would ultimately be, if I'm correct, be settled when they would line up specific things later on. But it ultimately, the failure of Orellana's second expedition, made everything kind of a moot point at that point. Um, so that's kind of it. If anyone else has any questions, otherwise we'll be able to wrap up early. So um, got one more coming in. Feel free to pop on, Luke, and just ask if you want to as well. That's all right. Yes. That would be Cabeza de Vaca, or who are you? Oriana. Okay, yeah, and this will basically be something that any of these guys could do, um, and that will literally be anything. They will trade buttons. They will trade. They will take nails. They will take anything that they have, and they will trade them to the native peoples. Um, and some of it is, I mean, like thread, things like that. They can unwind thread and trade it. It's really amazing whatever they have becomes part of it. And you'll find this in not just this story, but any story. Um, and I remember at best, like when I was thinking about Lewis and Clark expedition, they're doing the same thing. They're like basically like taking all the buttons off their shirts and things like that, and trading them because they have nothing else left. They've dealt everything that they could, but anything with metal was valuable, and they would actually build forges. They built a forge to make their boats, and so they would get all their metal, worth extra metal that they didn't need, and they would melt it down into things that might be useful. And again, simple things like nails were gold to these guys. And it was, again, it could be literally anything. You could look at your shirt right now, and someone would want my watch. Someone would want my zipper right here. And it's crazy, but they had never, the people in the Amazon had never seen this kind of stuff, or clothing, some of the clothing, stuff like that. No, it isn't. It's maybe, some of them could be, but they were like lucky. They're packing, you know, 20, 30 guys on each one of these things. And yes, what you're talking about, they don't have a lot of stuff. And so, yeah, you're just anything. And the other thing that would be really valuable was stuff like hatchets, tools, awls, just needles, uh, uh, things like one of the things that was a really big value was fish hooks. And I don't remember if it was for this expedition, but I found on other expeditions, they'll go nuts for fish hooks because they don't have anything like this, fine metal work metal like that. Thank you very much, Luke. If anyone else has anything, otherwise, we'll just wrap up. We'll get done early. Oh, Daniel says, thank you. Thank you, Daniel. And thanks for everyone who was here. I appreciate it. Thanks. Good day, everyone.